In the early months of the Pacific War, the night belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. There was a palpable sense of superiority among the crews of the Japanese destroyers and submarines that patrolled the dark waters of the Solomons, a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and for good reason. They had trained for a decade to fight in the pitch black, relying on oversized binoculars and rigorously drilled lookouts who could spot a silhouette against the horizon long before the enemy knew they were there. To them, the Americans were loud, clumsy, and blind. The Japanese sailors would joke that the American destroyers were more dangerous to themselves than to anyone else, their radios filling the airwaves with panicked chatter while their torpedoes, the technologically inferior Mark 14s, often bounced harmlessly off Japanese hulls. In the mess halls of the great naval base at Truk, officers toasted to the soft enemy who fought by the book but panicked when the ocean turned dark. They laughed because they were winning, and they laughed because they believed the spirit of the warrior could overcome any machine. But war is not static. It is a race of adaptation, and while the Japanese Navy relied on the drilled perfection of the human eye, the United States Navy was turning to the invisible physics of sound. The laughter began to die out not in a single dramatic battle, but in a slow, terrifying silence that spread across the shipping lanes of the Pacific in 1943 and 1944. The turning point was the refinement of sonar, and more importantly, the integration of the Combat Information Center, which took the chaotic noise of battle and turned it into cold, hard data. The shift was subtle at first. In the early years, a Japanese submarine commander could often slip past a destroyer screen by simply diving deep and waiting. They knew the American depth charges were set to explode at specific depths, and they knew the sonar operators were inexperienced, often chasing schools of fish or thermal layers in the water that reflected sound like a solid object. A skilled Japanese captain could play cat and mouse, mocking the destroyers above that dropped explosives miles off target. They called the American depth charges ash cans, and for a long time they were more of a nuisance than a death sentence. Then came the Hedgehog and the advanced QC sonar. The Americans stopped guessing. The story of this technological terror is best illustrated by the patrol of the USS England in May 1944, a destroyer escort that became a legend not for its size, but for the devastating efficiency of its sensors. By this time, the Japanese Psy Command had realized that their garrisons on Bougainville and other isolated islands were starving. The surface fleets couldn't break through the American blockade, so they turned to their submarines. A line of I-boats and R-boats was established to run a bucket brigade of rice, rubber, and ammunition to the trapped soldiers. The Japanese submarine crews were confident. They were running deep, running silent, and they knew the ocean floor better than anyone. They believed they were invisible. But up on the surface, the game had changed. The sonar operators on ships like the England were no longer just listening for a ping. They were reading the ocean's temperature gradients. They understood how sound bent through cold water, and they were armed with the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar system that didn't just dump explosives off the back of the ship. The Hedgehog fired a circular pattern of 24 contact-fused warheads ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a set depth and churned up the water, blinding the sonar, Hedgehogs only exploded if they hit the submarine. If the destroyer missed, the water stayed clear, and the sonar operator kept his contact. If they hit, the sub was instantly cracked open. On May 19, 1944, the laughter stopped forever for the crew of the I-16. The submarine was attempting to run supplies into Buin when the England sonar man picked up a faint metallic echo. It wasn't the distinct clatter of a surface ship, it was the sluggish, heavy movement of a submarine trying to hide. In the past, the Japanese captain would have initiated a crash dive, turned hard, and expected the Americans to lose the track in the wake. But the England didn't lose the track. The sonar locked on. The destroyer didn't rush in blindly. It stalked. Below the surface, the Japanese crew would have heard the terrifying, rhythmic ping, ping, ping of active sonar.
It is a sound that psychological studies of the era described as inducing a primal panic, the feeling of being watched by an unblinking eye in a room of total darkness. The I-16 maneuvered, changing depth, changing speed, trying every trick that had worked in 1942. But the England matched every turn. The American captain, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, guided his ship with the precision of a surgeon. When the England finally fired, there was no dramatic splash of depth charges rolling off the stern. There was just a ripple of mortar fire from the bow, followed by seconds of silence. Then, the ocean floor erupted. The Hedgehogs had found the hull. A massive underwater explosion rocked the destroyer, followed by the gruesome sounds of breaking steel and rushing water that every sonarman dreads and desires. I-16 was gone. But the England wasn't done. The Japanese command, unaware that the rules of physics had shifted against them, kept sending boats into the line. 3 days later, it was RO-106. The crew of RO-106 likely never even knew they were being hunted until the hull cracked. Then came RO-104 on May 23rd, then RO-116 on May 24th, then RO-108 on May 26th, finally RO-105 on May 31st. In 12 days, one American ship, guided by the invisible hand of sonar, had wiped out an entire Japanese submarine squadron. 6 submarines, 6 crews who had trained for years, who believed in the superiority of their spirit and their stealth, were erased from existence by men looking at green glowing screens in an air-conditioned room. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was devastating. The survivors of other engagements began to bring back stories of American destroyers that could see through the earth. The arrogance of the early war evaporated, replaced by a paranoia that paralyzed the fleet. They began to realize that the ocean was no longer a hiding place, it was a trap. This technological dominance extended to the surface fleets as well. The Tokyo Express, the Japanese tactic of running destroyers down the slot in the Solomons at night to drop supplies, had relied entirely on darkness. They would laugh at the Americans' inability to fight at night. But radar-equipped destroyers began to turn the dark into daylight. At the Battle of Cape St. George, Captain Arleigh Burke used radar to ambush a Japanese destroyer force. He launched torpedoes before the Japanese lookouts, the best in the world, even saw a shadow. The Japanese ships were hit by torpedoes that emerged from the blackness without warning. The hunters had become the blind. By 1945, the dynamic was fully inverted. The Japanese submarines that had once prowled the west coast of the United States and threatened aircraft carriers were now reduced to chitin, suicide torpedoes. It was a desperate admission that conventional naval warfare was impossible against the American sensor net. The American destroyers, now operating in massive hunter-killer groups, turned the Pacific into a grid of overlapping sonar domes. There is a specific, haunting account from late in the war that encapsulates this total reversal. A Japanese submarine, pinned down by 3 U.S. destroyers, sat on the bottom of the ocean, engines off, the crew sweating in the stifling heat, conserving oxygen. In 1942, the Americans would have dropped a few charges and left, assuming the sub had escaped. But in 1945, the destroyers simply waited. They sat above the sub, circling like sharks. They pinged the hull relentlessly, hour after hour. Ping, ping, ping. They knew exactly where the Japanese boat was. They didn't even need to attack immediately. They could wait for the sub to run out of air. Inside the steel tube, the Japanese sailors listened to the screws of the destroyers churning above them. They realized that their training, their Bushido spirit, and their loyalty to the emperor could not stop the sound waves bouncing off their hull. The laughter of 1942 was a distant memory, replaced by the mechanical reality of modern war. The sonar didn't care about bravery. It simply calculated distance and bearing. When the end came for the Imperial Japanese Navy, it wasn't just the atomic bombs or the airstrikes that broke them. It was the realization that the ocean itself had turned against them. The water, which they had worshipped and mastered for centuries, had been weaponized by American engineering. The destroyers they had once mocked were now the masters of the deep, and the silence of the Pacific was not filled with the laughter of the victors, but the relentless, unanswerable ping of the machine that found them in the dark. The age of the lookout was over. The age of the censor had begun, and it left no place to hide.